Hello, class. Today we're going to be talking about Gestalt therapy and the founder, Frederick Perls, also known as Fritz Perls, who lived from 1893 to 1970. This approach, um, if we're going to talk about kind of the theorist. Gestalt was all about sensation, perception, body feelings, emotion, and how that impacts the behavior. So, in short, when I think of Gestalt, I think of that awareness, and he used various techniques. One of the biggest that is known even beyond the scope of the profession is the empty chair technique. So if um, a patient or a client comes and um, has a lot of internal conflict, internal dialogue with, let's say, significant other, their mother, a big technique that Pearls used was put an empty chair, pretend that that person is sitting in that empty chair, and have a conversation. What do you think? What would you want to tell that person? And then the client would move to the other chair, and then they would perceive things from the perspective of that other person. Um, and that was really powerful. I've tried it with some of my clients that I've had, and it's been great. I think the value of it is that not only are they seeing things from their view, but you are kind of helping them see things of how that other person might perceive it. So you're trying to get into kind of the different perceptions, and again, we're talking about awareness here. So, when you watch some of the Gloria videos, you'll see that Gloria starts to do some movements, and Pearls really points it out and says, can you exaggerate that? Can that movement that you just did, can you exaggerate that? And if that movement would talk, what would it say? Um, to continue, like I said, Fritz Perls was born in 1893. So, when I think of Freud, Adler, that was mid 1800s, Perls, early 1900s to mid 1900s, and then some of the logotherapists were around that time to begin with. So you had all these different movements, and I think it was kind of that era of expansion and getting away from the psychoanalytic approach, which really dominated the field from the 1800s all the way to the mid 1900s. Um, so just to tell you a little bit about Pearls, born in Germany, um, was really influenced by expressionism, so the whole artistic movement, um, and kind of that, getting the feelings, and also like Viktor Frankl, he um, was impacted by World War II and some of the wars. He saw a lot of anti-Semitism. Similar to Viktor Frankl, he was impacted by some of what was going on with the war at the time. Um, but I think in general sense, this, like I said, this is an introductory course. I certainly want you to get the main gist. And to me, the main gist is that awareness. um, really exaggerating those nonverbals so that the client can see kind of the reality. Because like logotherapy, Pearls mentioned that everybody has their perspective, and part of the therapy process is to create that awareness. So he does mention that a lot. Be sure to know that. Also, Pearls mentioned something called blocks to energy. Um, the whole, the whole world Gestalt is saying that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So when we talk about Gestalt, we're talking about the whole organism. When you think about a person, you don't think about their brain, their hearts, their lungs. You think about it as a whole organism. Um, so certainly know that. Um, Another word that I want you to be aware of is confluence. Corey mentioned it, and that deals with um, a sense of being lost between self and environment. So Pearls, um, he mentioned that when a client comes to therapy, part of the therapist's role is to create awareness not only within themselves, but also within their environment. And part of that technique is using things like confrontation, which in the therapeutics, I know we think about in layman's terms as, confronting somebody, but in a therapeutic technique, that word I think is a little bit different. It means more of being the facilitator to facilitate some of that awareness, because clients are not able to facilitate that by themselves. So as a therapist, as a trained clinician, your role is to help with that facilitation, almost like a catalyst. They might be able to get that awareness eventually, but they're coming to you because you're the person that is there to help. Um, and part of his technique is using senses. So, when I was a teacher, we talked about the five senses. That was part of the curriculum. And, Gestalt really exaggerated that. And I think that's really powerful, especially for students in training, clinicians in training. Um, a lot of our communication is nonverbal. And part of being a good therapist is reading those nonverbals. I think Gestalt was, or Pearls was just a master at that. So, you'll see that when you look at the videos with Gloria. Also, be sure to know that there is a difference between um, contemporary Gestalt therapy and kind of what Gestalt um, advocated for, in the mid 1900s. So, with this contemporary, um, there is more emphasis on the therapeutic relationship and working collaboratively. So, similar to those core conditions that were talked about in Person Centered with Dr. Rogers. Also, similar to logotherapy, Gestalt talks about a continuum of awareness, helping them with the senses, not just the verbal, but really listening to them and helping them reach a level of awareness that will help them get through some of these challenges that they're going through. And I think that's really powerful. I mean, even as myself, I can think back, you know, working with a lot of the Spanish speaking clients. Um, a lot of them came from different regions, and some of their Spanish, I wasn't really sure because, like in English, there's different dialects. You know, people from the north, they use a different vocabulary than maybe somebody from Texas. So one of the things that I used was some of the nonverbal. You know, if I didn't understand a word, I didn't really want to interrupt them and try to clarify, you know, what did you mean by that? And I wanted to let them keep going because their story was really important, but I looked for signs to let me know, you know, oh, you know, she slowed down, the enunciation was different, her inflections was different, she started shape moving her leg, as kind of points of, oh, well, that might have been some trigger or something that occurred in the therapeutic process. And, you know, as you practice, as you get better at listening, you'll start to see things that maybe you didn't notice before. And I would encourage not only school counselors, but people that are training for the community to really look at that, even with your family, students, clients, caseworkers. Um, you know, when somebody's telling you something, look at their facial expressions, look at their feet, look at how their postures, and really look at all those nonverbals and see, you know, if that matches their verbal. A lot of times it doesn't. You know, I guess a typical example would be if somebody says, "Oh, how are you?" and you know, a student might just say, I'm good." Um, so, you know, the body is telling you something different than what the verbal is telling you. And I think that's what's so powerful about Gestalt, is that Gestalt really exaggerated that. You know, yeah, and you'll see this in Gloria. Gloria starts to move her hand, and he's like, just points it out and exaggerates that and asks her if your hand could talk, what would it say? And, you know, that's part of creating awareness because Gloria probably didn't know she was moving her hand. Even I use my hands a lot um, as part of, you know, just how I communicate. So, you know, just be sure to notice things like that as a counselor in training. Also, deflection. Gestalt talks about how people avoid things because it's safe. Um, and maybe you've experienced this yourself. You know, hard topics that are hard to talk about. So we'd rather not talk about them, deviate from them, and you know, kind of put them under the rug. Um, and Gestalt also mentions dichotomy, which is kind of a split in polarities. So he mentions that kind of the weak, strong, dependent, and dependent. And I think what he refers to that dichotomy is that we all have certain traits of dichotomies. You know, we want to portray something, but yet the reality is something else. You know, I want to portray that I'm strong, but inside my true awareness is telling me that I'm weak. Yet I'm here giving you a perception of something that maybe I don't even believe in. And I, you know, I think that happens quite a bit. Gestalt does mention, similar to psychoanalysis, a little bit of dream work, but his is different. Um, you know, he doesn't go into interpreting or analyzing some of those dreams. His point instead is to kind of look back at them and then to look at them as if they were happening now. And part of that is to, again, create awareness. Um, you know, put that in the present so that the client can be assisted in learning more about certain situation, a certain internal conflict, certain dichotomy. Um, and I've done some of that. I mean, like I mentioned previously, I don't have any expertise in dream analysis. I don't claim to be an expert in that, but dream work, when somebody has a conflict and they mention a dream, I think dream work is a powerful tool. And I mentioned the empty chair technique. Be sure to know that. Um, to me, that's one of my favorite techniques, especially when dealing with um, relationship conflicts, um, you know, um, worker, boss, spouse, um, mother, child, things like that. I think that's a really widely used techniques. I don't know a lot of Gestalt therapists, but many therapists that I know will tell you that they use the empty chair technique on a frequent basis. Um, and also make sure you know about kind of Gestalt talked about, or Pearls, I'm sorry, talked about kind of the experiments. So he mentioned similar to cognitive behavioral, to go out there and try something, test new ideas, and see how they work. And part of that is some of these homework assignments. You know, if somebody's feeling depressed, oh, I don't have any friends. Oh, okay, well, what can we do about that? Put that on the client. Oh, well, I used to like going to the gym, or I used to like um, going, to a book club or things like that. Oh, okay. Well, how can we get back at that? What do you think it would take to maybe experiment and see, um, how we can um, navigate some of those hurdles so that you won't think that you don't have any friends. Um, and part of Gestalt theory, the book mentioned, is also field theory. So exploring, talks about the environment, creating awareness. And I would challenge counselors in training, because when I took theories, one of my professors, or the professor that I took, he always mentioned, sit in a room and just be in the moment. Just be present. Look around, see all the stimulus, see all the objects, see how all the objects are influencing the environment. See the noises, and just be aware. And I think that kind of ties in with some of that meditation, some of that mind-body connection. Um, so be sure to kind of read about that. Look at kind of what some of the looks like. Um, Pearls also talks about introjection, and that mentions kind of the acceptance of others' beliefs without kind of assimilating or trying to fit in. I think that's really powerful. So, being respectful, um, obviously noticing those beliefs, but not letting those beliefs kind of influence your beliefs. And that I think is really cool, because it kind of deals with boundaries, kind of deals with um, learning kind of what your beliefs are enough to be able to respect what somebody else's beliefs are. And I see that a lot in politics, especially within the last few years, as I've maybe, I've gotten matured, or, I've read more about this. Um, but, part of this is being able to listen and being able to be respectful, and not necessarily agreeing, but having your beliefs and your standards to where you are able to hear somebody else. So, um, and I know this is an introductory course, but if you ever get a chance to read more about it, I think that's really powerful. That really for any therapist. Um, part of being a good therapist is being grounded and knowing kind of what your core beliefs are, to where you're not impacted or you're not influenced by the stress that you just shut down. Um, Pearls also mentioned self regulation. I think this is really important. Part of self regulation is knowing kind of who the person is, what their core beliefs are, um, kind of what their mission is. Almost, I hate to compare it to logotherapy, but, I do see some similarities in that. Um, so part of that being authentic to oneself, and that's kind of the paradoxical theory of change. Um, so letting them know that once they're authentic, once they take off those masks, then they can really start to understand not only themselves but their environments. Because talk to any person that's clinically depressed, and their perception is just completely skewed. It's almost like everything is just so dark and just lack of pleasure, lack of motivation, lack of if self-awareness. So part of Gestalt is to use these senses, use um, the nonverbals to help the client see some of that reality. Um, and as mentioned in with logotherapy, phenomenological, um, looking at it through their eyes, looking at it through their lenses and seeing how that awareness is is really influenced. Gestalt also mentions projection, and this is really important. Um, and with Freud, he talks about this, but Gestalt really goes into it in details, and he mentions that certain aspects of ourselves, um, we kind of project to the environment, and the opposite would be introjection. So some of the environment we kind of take in, and part of that is helping the client understand those projection, introjection tendencies, and letting them know that that kind of skews their realities. Um, so finally, we talked about the unfinished business, and that's things like resentment, guilt, anger. Um, Freud talks about that, or I'm sorry, Dr. Pearls talks about that, and how that kind of influences our reality. Somebody that's resentful, and I've seen this in many individuals. Um, when they see that person, that they have that resentment, their reality is completely skewed. That person might have changed, might have, moved on, but in their world, that resentment doesn't let them see that individual as they are now. So that unfinished business is, um, that's kind of one of the things that really stood out for me when I think of Gestalt. So, just to summarize, be sure to know some of the techniques. I think Pearl was just spectacular to the field. He added a lot. He added the um, nonverbals, the awareness, the whole body connection. And he really, I think, was a pioneer in that. And again, although don't consider myself a Gestalt therapist, I use a lot of the techniques because I think they're really valuable. Okay, so that's covers this chapter, and I hope you find this helpful.